Speaking of the Reds, we've got probably the foremost authority on Charlie Hustle, Pete Rose, here tonight, Keith O'Brien, and he informed me, he just learned about half an hour or so ago, that his book was an instant New York Times bestseller. After just a couple of days, it made a New York Times bestseller list. I've read an excerpt from it. The reviews are great. Keith has written a couple of other books. One of them is called Fly Girls. And on the front cover, there's a photo of female aviators from the 20s and 30s. I haven't read it yet, but I have to read it. It looks like an exciting book. Keith, I would love to have you come up and tell us about Pete Rose and how you wrote your book and the story of Charlie Hustle and the last glory days of baseball.
Thank you so much, guys, for coming out tonight. I feel bad about what I just did to Alan. You know, every time I do a new book event, I just tell folks that I just made the New York Times bestseller list. It's not really true. I'm just joking. It is actually true, and I did just find out just a little while ago. And it is incredibly gratifying for all the reasons we can understand. And it is a thrill to be able to share that news tonight here on the west side of all places. You know, where this story started, where this story lives, the heart of the entire thing. So I do think it is incredibly fitting. Also fitting is that, you know, when I began this project almost 3 years ago, no one had any idea that baseball and gambling would be back in the news on the same week that my book came out. Right. And of course, you know, all of you, I'm sure by now, have seen Pete's viral video that he did last week, in which he took a short video and posted it online saying that he wished that he had had an interpreter in the 1970s and 80s and he would have been scot-free. And it's a great line, it's funny, it serves its purpose, the video does go viral. But it is, you know, a bit more complicated than that. And I have to say that Pete Rose's universe is a place where chain reactions happen. And when something happens to Pete or happens to somebody else in this world, somebody else calls somebody else, who calls somebody else, it's that kind of place. And I know that because I actually am in this universe now too, whether I want to be or not. And this viral video is a perfect example of that. Last Tuesday, on the very first day that the book was published, I'm walking to my first book event in New York City on the Upper West Side, and I'm just like 5 blocks from the bookstore, and I got a text from a man named Tommy Giosa. Tommy Giosa was Pete's close friend in the 1970s and 80s, his inner circle guy who loved Pete and was willing to do anything for him, and you know, did a lot of things for him. You know, it kept his secrets. Hid his girlfriends, placed his bets on sports, paid his debts to bookies, placed his bets on baseball. And the text from Tommy said simply, "Have you seen the video?" And he sent me the clip. And I said, "Yeah, of course I've seen it." And Tommy replied and wrote, "LOL, I guess Pete forgot I was his interpreter in the 1970s and 80s. So that's Pete's world. That's the kind of thing that happens there. And I did not know that, you know, when my book project began. I simply knew that as a Cincinnatian and as someone who had lived this story in many ways, that I believed there was a way to further this story. I believe that all too often Pete's story has been looked at through the prism of through the prism of baseball. And I wanted to look at it as a story of a man. A story of a man from the west side of Cincinnati, ordinary working class background, a man of ordinary talents, ordinary athleticism, who has no business making the major leagues, much less becoming the all-time hit leader, who then does that, scrapes and claws his way to the top, and gets there, and then loses everything, through, in large part, his own choices, his own decisions, his own addictions. And I wanted to tell that story, with my knowledge as a Cincinnatian. I'm not in this book. There is no first person in here. There is no me. There is no I. But like you, I know what it felt like to be here when Pete was at his peak. I know what it felt to be here when Pete lost it all. And one of the goals for my book was to crack open the doors to rooms that have been closed, perhaps. And if that was possible, and when that did happen, when someone opened the door to a room that we as fans, we as readers, we the public had never been in before, when that happened, I wanted to linger in that room. And stay there and learn more and talk to anybody who was in that room. And I wanted to share, just to start the night, a photo that for me represented that kind of place. And also represented, I think, the sort of ethos that I was searching for in my book. That this was not a story about baseball. This was the story of a man, or really in the beginning, it's a story of a boy. This photo is of Pete Rose's 1956 city champion, 15-year-old Legion Ball baseball team. This team would win the city title in 1956, and then it would go on to win a national title as well, as a result of the fact that it won the city title. And I think what's amazing about this photo is, for one thing, I don't need to point out to you which one of these kids is Pete Rose. Not every 15-year-old boy looks like the man they will become. But this boy does. Also notable in this photo, at least for me and perhaps for you, all of these boys came from a probably 2-square-mile radius right here on the west side. These kids go to Elder High School and Moeller High School and St. X and Western Hills. And also notable to me is that Pete is not anywhere close to the best player on this team. The best player actually on this team is the boy standing right over Pete's shoulders. His name was Art Luby. And he was about 6'2" or so in this photo, a left-hander, a pitcher. Art Luby didn't lose a game that spring and summer and into September. Didn't lose a single game. Every time Art pitched, Pete's team won. And I should note, just because we're all here and we're all Cincinnatians, that Art Luby, unfortunately, is no longer with us. But his sister, Janice Wheathorn, is here tonight. And it was through her family and her relatives that I ultimately found this photo. And the last thing about it that I think is meaningful to me is just the size of Pete Rose here. Yeah, he looks like he could be like the bat boy on this team. He looks like he could be Art Luby's little kid brother. Not a future star of the major leagues. But of course he is. And he will be. And he will be that for many reasons. Some accidental, some intentional. But one key reason why Pete will ultimately become the player he will be is his father. Big Pete Rose, as many of you know, was himself a West Side star. He was the original Pete Rose. Excelled as a football player on the west side at a time when there was no professional football team. Playing semi-pro ball here and then working as a bank teller and a bookkeeper downtown. And it was Big Pete who really ingrains into his firstborn son that he needs to make it as an athlete. That he needs to be someone on the field. I did as many interviews as I could with boys who were in that photograph I just showed you a minute ago, who are still alive today. And many of those boys had hardly any memory of their own fathers being at their games. Now, this was a time when, dads couldn't make it to the ball game at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. They were working. But every boy I talked to in that photograph remembered Big Pete being there. Being there on the fence line, being there, at the backstop, urging his son on. And, today, in 2024, we would, have a phrase for that. Big Pete was sort of like one of the original, crazy youth sports dads. But the thing is, his son internalized everything he said. He did not reject it, young Pete. He wanted more of it. He was accepting the gospel that Big Pete was preaching. And he loved going to games with his father. This photo is actually, I found in the archives of the Delhi Historical Society, thanks to Alan March. This is Big Pete's football team here on the west side, 1947. Big Pete is all the way over there on the far left, and little Pete's right there in the middle, wearing the little helmet. Little Pete loves going to these games. And so he's listening to his father. And despite his lack of size, and despite his lack of talent, and despite many other obstacles in his way, Pete Rose will make it. And I don't think I'm ruining it for you to tell you, he will make it. And he will, get a chance to play for the Cincinnati Reds. And there are many lucky breaks that happen along the way to make that even possible. But one lucky break does come for Pete Rose in the spring of 1963. He has now played in 3 minor league seasons. He has had some really good minor league seasons, but he remains in the spring of 1963 pretty deep on the depth chart at second base. There is a starter in Cincinnati by the name of Don Blasingame, and there are 2 other players in the minors who are just objectively ahead of Pete on the depth chart. One you will remember, Tommy Helms. And the other one was a man named Bobby Klaus. And so Pete's chances of making the big league roster in 1963 do seem slim, except for one reason, except for this man. Fred Hutchinson, the manager of the Reds in 1963, was a former player himself who had succeeded in large part on his own grit and hustle, and saw in Pete something that he liked about himself. And it's Fred Hutchinson who is giving Pete a chance in spring training 1963. And suddenly, Pete Rose is starting games at spring training that year, including a game that will be very fundamental to the Pete Rose story to follow. One thing that I wanted to do with the book was identify key moments where Pete becomes Pete, or where Pete changes. And one of those moments is certainly when he receives the nickname Charlie Hustle. And so I did do a lot of reporting around that. I wanted to identify the exact moment that this happens, because there's a lot of different stories out there. And I did ultimately identify the game. It was a spring training game, March 17th, 1963, at Old Al Lopez Field in Tampa, Florida. And the Reds were playing the New York Yankees. And that day, the stadium is sold out. cannot imagine today, people have scaled the light posts in the outfield of the old Al Lopez field so that they can see the game. And Pete Rose is starting at second base with his father in the stands. And he is playing for his life. He's sliding head first in the bases. He's breaking up double plays, sliding hard. And then in a move that Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford find absurd, Pete Rose bunts to lead off the fifth inning in essentially a practice game. And they can't believe it. And they give him a name. And in the days to follow, the newspapers, by the way, had a different account of what the name actually was. The first account is that they called him Henry Hustle. For a while in the papers, they said maybe it was Henry Hustle that they called him. Then they said it was the Charlie Hustler. And it was only after a few more days that the press finally settled on the story of Charlie Hustle. And so that part of the story is probably apocryphal. You know, we may never actually really know what phrase, what term that Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford used during that day. What we do know is that people loved this name, and they loved this persona. In many ways, this story of Charlie Hustle, not Pete Rose, is that great American bedtime story. If you work hard, if you try hard, if you apply yourself, if you hustle, you can do anything. And for a while in the newspapers, actually, there were suggestions that Pete Rose could do anything. This is a real headline from 1978. There was serious conversation at the time in the middle of the Carter administration that maybe someone like Pete Rose could run for president and could win. And not all that absurd in the sense that he had been to the White House. He had met Jimmy Carter. He had actually celebrated Pete Rose Day in Washington. And on that day in Washington, the crowd at the Capitol building, in the House of Representatives, was surging around him so much that a page standing outside the doors asked the security guard if it was the president. And the security guard answered, no, it's better, it's Pete Rose. So we loved him. In the last 35 years, as Pete has made mistake after mistake, maybe we forgot that we did love him. And not just us in Cincinnati, but many others. Because in reality, you cannot write the story of baseball in the 20th century without Pete Rose. I mean, he's there for everything. He's there, of course, in the Big Red Machine years, those great teams, the epic 75 World Series, the follow-up 76 World Series. He's there for the hit streak in 1978, 44 games. He's angry, of course, when it ends because he wants 56. He wants to take down the all-time record he believes he could have. It's important to point out, I think, that this 44-game hit streak in the summer of 1978 is still the longest hit streak since 1941, DiMaggio's record. No one's come close before or after that. And then, of course, there's the hit record itself. And I do believe that if you were alive then and watching, you remember exactly where you were that night. I know that I remember exactly where I was. I was a 12-year-old boy in my parents' house in Anderson Township, standing next to the TV with my father. And this moment does matter for lots of reasons, but including probably this one. It is one of the records that will probably never fall. When this season started just a week ago, the active leader in career hits was Freddie Freeman, a really good player. If Freddie Freeman plays like he has for the last few years, for the next 5 years, maybe Freddie Freeman makes the Hall of Fame. But Freddie Freeman starts this season at age 34 with 2,115 hits. Even if Freddie Freeman averages over the next decade the number of hits he's averaged for the last 3 years, the best 3 years of his career, if he averages 190 hits for the next decade, defying the odds, Freddie Freeman still comes up short. He wouldn't pass Pete Rose. So the record probably stands, and maybe forever. But even while all of this was happening, even while we were celebrating him on this night and many others, even while Jimmy Carter was celebrating him in the Oval Office in Washington, there were things going on off the field that at times were open secrets in the Reds clubhouse, open secrets here on the west side, open secrets even at times in the offices of Major League Baseball. You know, he was, of course, not being faithful to his wife, Carolyn. And one of his many mistresses was this woman here, Terry Rubio, a woman he meets in Florida in 1976. She's in her early 20s, and Terry Rubio did speak to me for the book. While she bears Pete no ill will, and in fact still has warm memories of the years she had with Pete, she does sue him in 1979 in a paternity suit for the child that they had together. This affair and others ultimately leads to a very public divorce here in Cincinnati. And us here on the west side know that as popular as Pete Rose was in the 1970s, Carolyn Rose was maybe even more popular. And so this is a very public divorce. And here on the west side, families had to choose in the way we have to do sometimes in divorces. Were people going to still be friends with Carolyn, or were they going to be friends with Pete? And then while all of this is happening, there are already questions about his campaign. It doesn't just emerge out of nowhere in 1989. It's happening for years in the shadows, often right here on the west side. And then, of course, it will ultimately end with his banishment in 1989. This, the general outline of the story I just painted for you, is an epic story. However we feel about Pete Rose today, whether we support him or not, whether we cheer for him or not, objectively speaking, this is one of the most fascinating, epic, and controversial lives that any athlete has lived in the 20th century in America. And so that is why I wanted to tell this story. And again, as a Cincinnatian, I did want to tell it with as much intimate access as possible. And so, of course, I wanted to talk to Pete Rose. And so, I did what you would have to do that. I came back to Cincinnati. And I started doing interviews with people I knew Pete Rose, his friends, many people that you know too. And it was through those interviews that I was given an introduction to Pete. And Pete Rose has never spoken before to an author for a book unless he had some kind of editorial control over it. And I want to be clear here. Pete Rose did not have editorial control. But he did speak to me. And by the fall of 2021, I was doing interviews with Pete on the phone and in person, like here at his favorite diner in Las Vegas, where he lives today, and is a regular. Pete and I spent many days there together. I was here with Pete later that fall when he placed the first bet at the blackjack table downtown at the brand new casino. And I think we need to stop for a moment as Cincinnatians just to recognize the absurdity of that thing I just said, that we built a land casino like 4 blocks from Old Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati, one of the most conservative cities in America. It's sort of crazy, right? And yet it happened. And when it happened, they wanted Pete Rose, and I was there for that. By the way, he does hit blackjack on that deal because, of course, the deck was stacked. And, I got to hang out with Pete as he hung out with other Cincinnati stars like Drew Lachey, for those of a certain age. Drew Lachey might mean something to you, from 98 Degrees. Drew Lachey wearing his Reinstate Pete t-shirt on the day that he runs into Pete. And I also got to spend lots of time with Pete Rose in the place where we often see him today at the autograph shows. And, I want to say that, I think Pete unfairly gets criticized for doing the autograph shows, to be honest, because lots of athletes that you love do these shows. It's a source of income for all of them. And there is a lot of appropriate jokes about how much Pete signs, because he does sign a lot. But one interesting thing I learned at the autograph shows is that many stars have rules, strict rules, about what they will and won't sign. They'll only sign baseballs. Or they'll only sign baseballs and their jersey. They won't sign cards. They won't sign bats. They won't sign photographs, etc., etc., etc. There are lots of rules. Pete Rose, I think it's worth noting, has no rules. He will sign your childhood lamp. I've seen that. He will sign your Little League baseball glove that's been sitting in your garage for the last 40 years. I've seen that. He will sign baseball cards. He will sign photographs of John Dowd. He will sign the Dowd Report. And he will sign body parts, as he did with this woman here.
I'm here, everybody.
Oh, you're here? Oh, we have follow-up questions. Wow, this is amazing. This story is so great. I cannot believe you're here. We met at an autograph show in December 2021.
We did.
And when she came to the podium or to the table to get Pete's autograph, you were hyperventilating.
I was so flustered.
You were very nervous.
I was.
And you were so excited. And what I remember about that interaction is that you wanted to tell Pete that you were doing this because your father was one of his biggest fans. And you were doing this for your father. And that kind of thing is actually something that I saw many times. The emotion, the hyperventilation. I actually saw that many times. In fact, several times while I was with Pete Rose, I saw people break down and cry when they met him. It often happened not at autograph shows, but just if they ran into him, like out of the blue, at a diner in Las Vegas. And when it happened, they weren't coming over to get an autograph. Usually, they just wanted to come over and say hello, and say that they recognized him, and maybe tell Pete a short story. And the people who did cry were often men of a certain age, men over the age of 65. And after I had seen it happen a few times, I finally asked Pete, and I said, "What is this? How do you explain this happening?" And Pete is actually, not great at self-reflection or introspection. But his answer to my question about the men who cry, I think, was right. He said to me, "I think I remind them of their fathers. I think I remind them of them as boys going to ball games with their fathers and watching me play, and that's why they become emotional." And I think Pete was right about that. And in the time I was with Pete, I did learn so much and did really appreciate his time. And things were good. We were talking. There was no problems. There was no arguments. There was no contention. And then one day, Pete Rose just stopped calling me back. And I don't know why. I would only be speculating if I guessed. And of course, that was disappointing. Because there are lots of follow-up questions I wish I could have asked Pete Rose, as I did more and more reporting. But this book was never going to be just about Pete Rose, or not just built on interviews with Pete Rose. This book was always going to be bigger than that. And I tried to look at this story through a kaleidoscopic lens of all the people who lived in it. Because Pete Rose has a certain gravitational force to him. And if you passed through his universe, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in particular, you could get sucked in by that gravitational force to the point that your own life would maybe be defined by a night, by a moment, by a ball game, by a bet, by an argument you might have had with Pete Rose. And I wanted to share a few of my favorite anecdotes here of some of those stories. I want to start with Al Esselman. Here on the west side, that name might be familiar to some of you. Alphonse Esselman in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was a fairly prominent West Sider. He lived on Beach Meadow. He was a member of the Western Hills Country Club. He had nice cars. His wife had nice fur coats. And I wanted to learn as much as I could about Al Esselman because he was Pete's first bookie. And so I wanted to do as much reporting around Al as I could. But Al Esselman has been dead for many years, so I couldn't interview him. And so I tried to interview others who knew Al Esselman, including Al Esselman's children. And he does have a few, and I managed to talk to one, and it was his oldest daughter. Her name was Jackie Esselman. Today, Jackie Esselman Fry. And I called her sometime in 2022, and I got her on the phone. I explained who I was and what I was doing, and that I was from Cincinnati. And Jackie did the thing that we do to each other when we meet new people. She asked me, "Where'd you go to high school?" And I told her I went to St. X, but I had grown up in Anderson Township. And she said, "Oh, I lived in Anderson Township for like 30 years. What street did you live on?" And I said, "Oh, I lived on Deer Haven Drive up by Wilson Elementary." And she said, "Oh my gosh, I live on Blair House," which by the way is like a block away. And I said, "Wait a second, Jackie Fry, wait, did you have a son named David?" And she said, "Yeah, Dave, that's my oldest son." I said, "Oh my God, Mrs. Fry, this is Keith O'Brien. I was at Immaculate Heart of Mary with David Fry, and you took me to the monster truck pool at the Cincinnati Coliseum in 1983. True story. Only could happen in Cincinnati. And through interviews with Jackie and many others, I was able to sketch out a portrait of Al Esselman. And it is important, not for sordid or salacious reasons, but because when Pete Rose gets in trouble in 1989, it's not for something that happened 3 weeks earlier, or 3 months earlier, or even 3 years earlier. It's a problem that's been happening for years. And so I want to identify when this begins. And Al is also important for other reasons, because he's a good West Side guy. And even when Al gets picked up by the federal authorities twice in the 60s and 70s, he does not rat out his friend Pete Rose. And even when he has debts that Pete Rose needs to pay, he tells no one. So Al is important. Another interesting Cincinnati story is this one. And it involves my mother. That's my mom on the left there. She's a nurse. This was 2021 during COVID times. She was giving vaccines at a pharmacy in northern Kentucky. I was here for my reporting. I think it might have been the same week we met. And I got my shot that day from my mom. I took a photo. And you know, my mom is like the grandma assassin. She will find out everything about you in 3 minutes. She'll find out where you live, who your wife is or your husband, how long you've been married, what your job is, who you know. She'll find out everything. And not long after this, my mom was giving a shot at the vaccine at the same pharmacy, and a man came in named Dave. Dave was there for his vaccine. We know how long that takes, what, like 2 minutes. And then my mom starts talking to Dave and asks him what he does, and he says, oh, I'm a baseball coach. And she said, oh, really? What do you mean? Like, where do you coach? She's like, oh, I coach at a high school in Kentucky. And my mom says, oh, my son is working on a book about baseball, actually about Pete Rose. And Dave says, oh, well, your son might be interested to meet me. Maybe you should give him my number because the man she was sitting with was Dave Collins. And Dave Collins is important. You know, everybody, when they do a book on somebody big, wants to talk to the other big people. Oh, you want to talk to the other Hall of Famers, the big stars. You want to be able to tell people events like this, you're pals with those big stars. But what I learned in doing this book, in talking to some big stars and some other not big stars, is that sometimes it was the guy at the end of the bench. It was the guy who didn't play much, who had the great stories about Pete Rose. And Dave Collins was one of those. Why? Well, because in 1978, when Dave Collins gets traded to Cincinnati, he has played 3 previous seasons for 2 terrible teams, the Seattle Mariners and the California Angels. He is thrilled to be a Cincinnati Red. He doesn't care that he's not going to play. He is thrilled to just to be at batting practice, at the batting cage, with Johnny Bench and Pete Rose, and Dave Collins is a sponge. He is listening, he is watching, because he wants to learn from the greats. And Dave Collins had lots of great stories he could tell me about 1978. It is an important year, because that is the year of the hit streak that we discussed earlier. And in that streak, Dave Collins has lots of memories of what happens that day, and that summer. But more importantly, Dave remembered something else. Dave remembered a moment before the streak, when there was chatter around the batting cage because Pete Rose was missing. This was notable because no one loved batting practice more than Pete Rose. He would stay the longest. He loved the banter around the cage. He just loved swinging. And so the fact that Pete Rose wasn't at batting practice was unusual. So Dave Collins starts asking around, where's Pete? And the story around the batting cage that day, that I later corroborated with other sources, is that at that moment, there was some kind of meeting in the office of Reds President Dick Wagner. And that meeting included Dick Wagner, Pete Rose, and at least one official from the front office of Major League Baseball. And the conversation that day was about deaths. It was about gambling. 1978. This is 11 years before stories like this will make headlines. But it doesn't in 78. It goes away. There are no stories. There is no punishment. There is no ramifications. We don't even know really what happened. Faye Vincent, the future deputy commissioner of baseball under Bart Giamatti, and then the ultimate commissioner of baseball after Giamatti died, told me that when Rose got in trouble in '89, Faye personally went looking for this report from 1978 and couldn't find anything. So the gambling is happening. it is potentially a problem. And it is involving others. It is involving the so-called interpreters. It is involving men like Tommy Giosa. This is Tommy Giosa right here in his senior year at New Bedford High School in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And in this season right here, Tommy Giosa bats .500. And to show you how difficult it is to be Pete Rose, to suddenly just make it, Tommy doesn't get a minor league contract out of batting .500 his senior year at New Bedford. He doesn't get a major league deal. He ends up playing baseball at a community college in nearby Brockton, Mass. And the only good thing that really happens to Tommy in his short time playing for this community college team is that they play in a tournament in Tampa, Florida in 1977 and 78 at old Al Lopez Field. At the same time, the Reds are there. And Tommy Giosa just happens to be staying at the same hotel as Pete Rose. And it is here, through an odd and curious set of reactions, that Tommy gets sucked in by the gravitational pull. And by 1979, he's no longer playing baseball. He's just doing whatever Pete wants him to do. He's staying at his house here on the west side. He's living here in Cincinnati. He's doing Pete's dry cleaning. And he's placing his bets with bookies. And he's happy to do these things for Pete. Because Pete is doing so much for him. Shortly after Tommy came to Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Enquirer wrote this story, not about Pete, but about Tommy Giosa. Labeling him the next Charlie Hustle. You can note here in the photograph that Tommy is wearing the same number as Pete here at the University of Cincinnati in the one season he will play there for the Bearcats. He only gets this opportunity because of Pete Rose, and he will get others. Tommy gets tryouts with the Blue Jays, the Phillies, the Orioles, but he can't catch on anywhere because it is hard to be the next Pete Rose. It's basically impossible. And so, baseball is over for Tommy, and now he's just doing what Pete wants him to do. And he's happy to do that until he isn't. Because, when you gamble a lot, and the money gets messy. And what do people like to argue about? Money. And in time, there are lots of arguments in Pete's inner circle about money. Some of those involve Tommy Giosa, and he's ultimately excommunicated from Pete's inner circle. And so therefore, in 1989, Tommy Giosa has no reason not to tell investigators everything when they come knocking on his door back in his childhood house in New Bedford. But Tommy won't do it. Tommy is loyal to Pete to the end. A mistake that is and ultimately a costly one for Tommy. Because he will not talk to John Dowd, the investigator that baseball has hired, because he will not cooperate with baseball's investigation. In early April 1989, Tommy walks out the door of his house in New Bedford to find the FBI agents waiting to take him in. Tommy will ultimately serve 2 years in prison for crimes that he committed right here in Cincinnati. And the last person I want to mention tonight is a man who is not a Cincinnatian and has only a brief and tangential connection to the Pete Rose story. But like many, had that one moment, that one play, where they got sucked in to the universe and could never escape. I want to talk, to conclude, about Ray Fosse.
Yeah.
Does anybody up close have their book? Can I borrow your book real quick? Ray Fosse was, thank you so much. Ray Fosse was the star catcher of the Cleveland Indians in the 1970s. And it's important to point out, Ray Fosse was drafted in the same draft of Johnny Bench in front of Johnny. The Indians wanted Fosse. He was, many Indians pitchers would say later, the best catcher they ever had for their entire careers. And Ray Fosse is having the best year of his life in 1970 when he gets chosen for the All-Star team to be played right here in Cincinnati. In the first half of that season, Ray Fosse has hit 16 home runs. He is on pace for more than 30 home runs as a catcher. And is thrilled to be playing in this All-Star game in Cincinnati. It's big for many reasons. This game will include 24 future Hall of Famers. 24. Some of the biggest names in baseball. Other big names are at the game that night in the press box or in the stands. Mickey Mantle is the color commentator that night on the NBC broadcast. That broadcast is going to be seen by 50 million people. The largest audience to watch an MLB All-Star game to date. They're tuning in because of the stars. They're tuning in to see this brand new field, Riverfront Stadium. It will be only the second All-Star game played on artificial turf. And the stadium has been sold out for weeks. The call center, the brand new call center downtown at Riverfront Stadium, the fuses blow one night taking the calls until the tickets are gone. And one person is there who is notable. It's Richard Nixon, President Richard Nixon. And he's there with Bowie Kuhn. Bowie Kuhn, the commissioner of baseball, is the man pointing in that photograph. And we can imagine this moment right here. President coming to an all-star game, throwing out the first pitch from the first row of the seats. What we can't imagine is that Nixon stays for the whole game. Wow. He's there all night. And he's not even flying back to Washington when it's over. He stays downtown. Wow. And he wants to be there because it feels big. It feels momentous. And I try to do new and voluminous reporting around this game, around this moment, because I do believe it changes everything. Up until this moment, most people, maybe not us, but most people have never seen Pete Rose play. He is a name in the box scores. He's a name in Sport Magazine. He's a player that's featured in Sports Illustrated, but they haven't seen him. In an American League city, forget about it. The Reds didn't play very many nationally televised games in the 1960s. They weren't that good then. So in 1970, this is the moment. And in the 12th inning, Pete Rose, as we all know, is going to come barreling around third to score that winning. And there's a famous photo of this collision between Fosse and Rose. Many of us have seen it. It's the collision photo where Pete is barreling into him. You can't even see Pete's face. It's just the back of his jersey. And Fosse is bracing himself for the impact. And I could have licensed that photo. When an author chooses books or photos for their book, you can choose any photo as long as you're willing to pay for it. But I wanted to choose a different photo of this moment. I wanted to choose this photo here. I chose this photo, which was probably taken about 3 seconds after the first one, because this is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. Ray Fosse is cratered in the dirt. Rose is standing over him, having scored the winning run. And in this moment right here, Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. And I will read a brief passage from my book about this, and then I'll be happy to take any questions, and I will be happy to sign any and all books tonight outside for as long as you want. So I'm going to pick up the story here in the 12th inning. It's 4-4. Richard Nixon is in his seats. 50 million people are watching on TV. Pete Rose gets a hit another. Men on first and second. Pete is standing on second base with 2 outs. And the Cubs' Jim Hickman is coming to the plate. Hickman thought there was more to life than baseball, and his statistics proved it. He had a lifetime batting average of just .236 entering the 1970 season. He would play in just 1 All-Star game in his career, this one, and he nearly missed it. Hickman had opted to fly in from Chicago that afternoon. The plane was delayed, beset by mechanical problems, and Hickman arrived so late that he couldn't even take batting practice. He was nervous under the lights at Riverfront, and possibly better suited for his next job. Within a few years, Hickman would be growing soybeans in Tennessee. But when the Angels' Clyde Wright served up a fastball inside, Hickman swung, and off the bat it was clear that the ball was going to fall for a hit in shallow center field. On second base, Pete Rose never saw it land. He did what he was supposed to do. He took off running. With 2 outs, he was moving on contact. He locked in on his third base coach, the Cubs manager, Leo DeRocher. And by the time he reached third base, he could see that DeRocher wasn't just sending him home. The old manager was almost running there with him. DeRocher was leading Pete Rose down the line, waving his arms and shouting, "You gotta go, you gotta go." Pete had to score. In the AL dugout, manager Earl Weaver thought it was all over. Pete was too fast and his jump was too good. There seemed to be no way for anyone to throw him out at home. But the baseball skimmed across the stadium's new artificial turf like a skipping rock on a quiet lake, smooth and fast and true. 3 perfect bounces into the waiting glove of Kansas City center fielder Amos Otis, and Otis didn't hesitate. He came up firing. Everyone in the stadium now realized that the play was going to be close. Pete's wife, Carolyn, Pete's parents, Bossy's young wife, Richard Nixon, and Pete himself. He stole a quick glance over his left shoulder just as Otis collected the ball and then turned back toward the plate. He was halfway between third and home now, running flat out, fully committed. The throw was coming, and Ray Fosse, Pete's dinner companion from the night before, was straddling the third base line a few feet in front of home. The young catcher, the next Johnny Bench, with millions of fans watching on TV, and his peers, the future Hall of Famers, counting on him to make the tag, wasn't about to get out of the way. He stood his ground, placing his 215-pound frame between Pete and the plate. If Pete slides head first, he takes Fosse out the legs or never makes it home. If he tries to go around him, hook sliding, he could be out. The throw could beat him. And if he slides head first, Pete's signature move, it's probably the worst possible outcome. Pete breaks a collarbone, maybe both collarbones. Still, instinctively, he almost does it. 4 steps before the plate, he begins to lean into his head first slide, chin going down, hands coming out. Then, seeing Fosse up close, he hesitates, thinks better of it, plants his right foot in the turf, changes course, and makes a different choice. The only choice left for Pete to make as he's barreling down on Fosse. He decides to lower his shoulder and barrel into Fosse, standing up. A human spear, unleashed in the hot summer night. Both men fall to the ground, and Fosse rolls over. But since Otis's throw never lands in Fosse's glove, the call is easy for the umpire to make. Pete is safe. Yes, all the way in the back with a question.
Where's Giosa at today?
Sorry?
Where's Tommy Giosa at today?
Tommy Giosa lives in Florida. He's doing very well. Tommy Giosa completely rebuilt his life. And I think that's nothing short of a miracle. After serving 2 years in federal prison in the 1990s. He was very gracious with his time. He spoke to me for probably 14 hours. I spent a day at his house in Florida. He was wonderful. Tommy has nothing but love for Pete, still to this day. Tommy is able to also, see the mistakes that Pete Rose has made in the last 35 years. It was Tommy who actually told me that if Pete Rose, Tommy said, if Pete had gotten out of prison himself in 1990, 1991, and instead of doing a radio show, had just gone campus to campus, college to college, across the country, giving speeches about the dangers of gambling and doing it for free, Tommy said, everybody would have forgiven him in an instant, and he probably would have been in the Hall of Fame decades ago. And Tommy might be right about that. Yes?
I know you said that Pete stopped returning your phone calls. Do you think that you'll try to reach out to him again, or do you just respect his decision to stop communication?
So the question is Pete stopped returning my calls? Do I expect to reach out to him again? Or, do I respect him and stop communication? I'm still in touch with lots of Pete's really good friends. People he sees all the time. And so I don't really know, again, why he has stopped. Out of respect, yeah, I don't bother him. But, like when I had the book jacket, when I saw the book jacket for the first time, like last September, I texted it to him. When the book got a great review in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, I texted it to him. At my book event in New York a week ago, somebody had made cookies with Pete Rose's, with the jacket on it. And I'm mailing a few to Pete. I have no ill will. I wish he had continued to speak to me, but I respect his decision not to. Yes, in the Reds, sure. Question is, did I talk to Petey, his son? I met Petey. We did talk in person. Petey ultimately decided not to speak. But I did interview Carolyn at length many times, and also other children of Pete's. You had a question?
Yeah, so does my understanding is that there's no evidence of Pete having bet on baseball at all until 1986. Is that still what the evidence, as far as we know, is? And furthermore, they've never bet on the Reds to lose, right? Is that your understanding?
The question is essentially, is it 1986 when he started betting on baseball, and is it true that he never bet against the Reds? There are scant few actual records of Pete's betting, right? I'm talking about documents instead of just, what people might say. And so it is hard to pinpoint. What I can say is, Pete has said for years that he began betting on baseball in the postseason 1986, which would have been 2 months after his last at-bat as a player. He was betting on baseball in October of 1986. I know that from interviews that I did with others, like Tommy Chiosa, Paul Chance, and other folks. But there is a betting notebook that one of his other friends kept, a man named Mike Bertolini. And this notebook is not complete. It's not like a full notebook, but there are dozens of pages of it that have turned up in court records. And I also interviewed Mike Bertolini about it. And based on the notes in the betting notebook and Bertolini's own recollections, Pete begins at least betting on baseball in the spring of '86. And so, at a minimum, it begins then. And I will say that there is no evidence that Pete Rose bet against the Reds or bet against himself. Even people who don't like him and have no reason to protect him have never alleged that. But I will say, based on the debts that Pete Rose was accruing in the mid-1980s, and certainly by '86, '87, it is a concern. All right, we all understand the reason why the rule is there. why it still matters today, that somebody today, a player, wouldn't be betting on their phone or having their brother bet on their phone, because of someone who gets in arrears to a bookie or to nowadays a legal betting platform and has some control of the outcome of the game could ultimately affect that. There is no evidence that Pete Rose ever did it. If baseball had known in '89 about the debts that were happening earlier, they would have been gravely concerned. Yes, in the black and then the red.
But baseball kind of backdoored Pete a little bit. I mean, everybody in this room probably knows Pete's not an angel, and he did break the cardinal rule of betting on his team. But he was eligible for the Hall of Fame, and I think the Hall of Fame, as far as everything that I've read, and I was a big Pete junkie and still am. Baseball changed the rules.
Yeah.
And they made the rule that after they banned him, the rule was anybody that was banned couldn't be eligible for the Hall of Fame.
Yes.
But that rule wasn't put into effect until he was banned.
Yes. This is a very important story.
Because they were afraid he was going to end up on the ballot and he'd have been voted.
He was going to end up on the ballot.
He would have been on the ballot and they would have to make a decision. And I think baseball was afraid that the writers, regardless of whether he bet as a manager, would have put him in. And they didn't want to deal with it. And
Yeah.
that's why I personally believe he's never going to be on the ballot.
So, yeah, let me restate that so everybody can hear it. So, yeah, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Tom?
Tom just pointed out, in 1989, when Pete Rose signs the document, and he does sign a document agreeing to his banishment, he knows full well on that day in late August '89 that he is going to appear on the ballot 2 years later in 1991, 5 years after his last at-bat as a player. He knows that completely. But as Tom said, in February 1991, 10 months before Pete's name would have appeared on the actual ballot, the Hall of Fame voted, first at a committee level, and then at the board level, to change the rule. And the rule going forward with this was that only players in good standing, only eligible players, could appear on the ballot. It effectively was the Pete Rose corollary. And the baseball writers were livid, because it was the first time in the history of the Hall of Fame, so at that point about 60 years of votes, that they had pre-screened a player out of the pool of possible candidates. And lots of columns were written in February 1989 in papers across the country by baseball writers who were furious. And some of them wrote that they weren't even going to vote for him. They weren't going to vote yes for him, but they wanted the opportunity to vote no. But to your point, it would have been very interesting to have had that vote. And not just that vote, but as you know, once you're on the ballot, you're there for 10 years. That's the rule. And so there would have been 10 years of votes. And what happens when we're voting on things? Well, then we're talking about it more. And we're debating it more. And we're hashing it out. But we didn't get that chance with
That's
Pete.
probably why he signed it, right? Because he knew, I'm going to have my shot. I'm going to have my just due for what I did on the field. And he took, he took it away from him ultimately, but they really took it away from him because they didn't give him that opportunity.
I agree 100%, and you know who else agreed with you is Sparky Anderson. That week when they made that rule at the Hall of Fame, Sparky, of course, was still alive, Pete's longtime friend, former manager of the Reds. And Sparky said that it was a huge mistake, that they were going to be living with this mistake forever. And Sparky said specifically, because we won't be able to vote on this, this decision and the Pete Rose thing is going to loom over baseball forever.
Right,
And Sparky was right about that, because here we are. Yeah, in the red, yes.
I haven't heard about Pete for a while, but how's his health now? Is he good, bad, or is he?
Well, there are folks in the audience who maybe could answer the question better than me, who've seen him far more recently. When I saw him and was with him up until 2022, he was in great health. His memory was crisp. You know, he had all the usual ailments that an 81-year-old man has. Walked with a limp, his knees hurt him, all those things. But his memory was great. This was a man who could still remember with instant recall entire pitch sequences in games, who could remember arcane statistics about his own career, like how many doubles he hit for the Macon Peaches in 1962. All of that. Yes. One last question right here.
Does your subtitle, The Last Glory Days of Baseball, any thoughts on that, why you included that in there?
Yeah, questions about the subtitle, The Last Glory Days of Baseball. I think Pete Rose is not just a man and not just, an icon, controversial though he may be. He is a fault line, I believe. I think you can look at what happened in 1989 with Pete Rose as a line that divides sort of the era of the heroes from the era of the cheaters. And that's a real broad thing, but let me explain what I mean. And I don't mean to be like nostalgic for this era of the heroes. They were never perfect people. In fact, baseball in the 1960s and 70s was rough and tumble, filled with lots of colorful characters who did and said things in the 1960s and 70s that you could never do or say today. And the game was more dangerous. They slid hard into second all the time. Nobody complained. Nobody was ejected. They made up for it by settling scores on the field, by putting a fastball in that guy's lower back the next time he came to the plate. And again, nobody was ejected or suspended, and there weren't 5 days of debates on ESPN about a player's worth. It just happened, and they moved on. And I think in '89, I think certainly here in Cincinnati, but I think even nationally, with this scandal, we all lost a little something. It's sort of like the end of the age of the innocents. And I think it's also notable that this summer, 1989, when baseball is pursuing Pete Rose for his gambling, they are already doing steroids in the locker room in Oakland. And that problem will create a much bigger problem for baseball over the next 20 years. And I think some of the problems in baseball today are still related to that problem. Many of the rules that were created just last year were to bring back more action, more speed, less swinging for the fences, all these things that came up during the steroid era. And so I don't mean to suggest that there is no glory left in baseball. I am still a baseball fan. But it isn't the same. And this was a special time. And Pete Rose's career spanned the entirety of that time. And I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, for all your questions and your patience. I will be signing books out there for anybody who wants to stop by the table. Thank you so much.